There exists a grief no one warns you about. Not the grief of losing someone beloved, though that carries its own blade, but the grief of a body that has not received the news. The grief of milk arriving warm and insistent for a mouth that will never find it. A grief without ritual, without mourning clothes, without neighbors darkening your doorstep with casseroles and hushed tones. The world does not hold vigils for children it never knew. It simply continues. And you stand still in the current while everything streams past without looking back. Eliza Fernsby knew this grief as one knows the shape of a room in darkness. She had carried her son 9 months. She had felt him turning in the small hours, those slow, submerged movements that belong to no other bond, that exist only in the space between a woman and the life forming beneath her ribs. She had laid her hand against the swell of herself and believed, with the reckless, burning certainty of a woman who has nothing else left to place her faith in, that he would redeem her, that he would make the abandonment legible, that he would answer every question she had swallowed rather than speak aloud. Was I worth staying for? Was any of it true? Does it matter in the end that I was here at all? She believed he would belong to her completely, without condition, in a world that had already stripped everything else away. He lived 11 minutes. She counted each one. Afterward, she lay in the narrow bed of her rented room above the butcher's shop in Ashwick, and she listened to her own body with something close to horror, because her body had not been told. Her body carried on with its ancient, impartial labor, the milk arriving on the second day like a tide governed not by sorrow, but by chemistry and clock. She pressed her palms against herself in the dark and felt the warmth. And something inside her fractured in a way she had no words for. Not her heart, deeper. The part of her that had believed, without proof and against every indication, that the universe was watching. 300 miles distant, in a manor house, thick with beeswax and old wealth and fresh mourning, a different species of loss was seeping into the stone. The Duke of Windermere had a son. The Duke of Windermere no longer had a wife. And the child, small, furious, impossibly present, screamed through the nights in a house crowded with servants who had no answer for him, tended by a man whose hands would not stop trembling. Dorian Graves, 7th Duke of Windermere, had led men through battle. He had brokered treaties that redrew borders. He had buried his father at 19 and stepped beneath a title so crushing it took him 2 years to learn to stand upright under it. He was not, by any fair assessment, a man who came undone. Yet every time he looked at his son, this small, red, catastrophically alive creature who had cost his wife her last breath and seemed entirely ignorant of the debt, Dorian felt something that was not quite grief, not quite love, something far less readable than either, something lodged in his chest like a bird trapped in a flue, frantic and without direction, making it profoundly difficult to draw air. 2 people, 2 losses, and between them, a child who was starving. This is the story of what happened when they found each other. If you are new here, subscribe and turn on notifications. For those who have been here before, thank you. You know what happens in this space. So settle in. Close your eyes if you wish. And let me tell you about Eliza Fernsby and the Duke who did not yet know he needed her. The letter from Mrs. Holt arrived on a Thursday. Eliza nearly left it unopened. She had been sitting in the same chair for 6 days, not from weakness, but because movement felt like a betrayal of something she could not name. Each time she rose, the house reminded her she was alone within it. The rooms were small and stubbornly ordinary. They had no tolerance for grief. The kettle still demanded filling. The fire still required laying. The world carried on with a blunt, almost offensive practicality, and Eliza could not summon the strength to match it. Each time she passed the cradle, borrowed from a neighbor, lined by her own hands with flannel she'd spent 3 months saving to afford. She had to wrench her gaze away so fast it left her light-headed. She hadn't moved it. Couldn't say why. It felt essential that it stay where it was, as though shifting it would constitute an admission she wasn't prepared to make. But the letter waited on the table, and Mrs. Holt had shown her kindness when no one else bothered. The midwife had gripped her hand through 8 hours of labor, had murmured steadily through the darkest stretch of night, had been the one to tell her, with a calm so solid, Eliza had seized it like a lifeline. What had come to pass? So she unfolded the page. Mrs. Holt's handwriting was blunt as the woman herself. A child at Windermere Manor, a boy 3 weeks old. His mother died, bringing him into the world, and he has turned away every wet nurse they've tried. 4 so far. He is losing weight. The Duke is desperate. I gave him your name. Forgive me for that. Come if you can. Come quickly. Eliza read it a second time. Then her eyes drifted to the cradle. She considered what it would mean to go, to carry this body, still producing milk for a child who would never need it, and offer that milk to someone else's son, whether that amounted to betrayal or grace. She sat with the question a long while. In the end, she concluded she could not afford the distinction. She was 24 years old. She had no husband, no money, no reputation worth defending in any county where her name was known. She had a body still faithfully performing the duties of motherhood for a child already gone. And somewhere beneath the grief lived a terrible stubbornness, not the kind born of strength, but the kind that grows from sheer refusal to let everything that has happened be the last words spoken. She stood. She began to pack. The journey to Windermere Manor consumed the better part of a day aboard a mail coach that reeked of damp wool, aged leather, and the particular weariness of passengers headed somewhere they'd rather not be. She claimed the window seat and watched England slide past, the flat expanse of Somerset yielding to gentler, rolling green, and tried not to examine what she was doing. She failed mostly. Her mind wandered to the last time she had travelled anywhere, carrying hope. 2 years prior, following a man who had made promises with the effortless surety of someone who had never once been held to one. She had believed him because wanting to believe was easier than the alternative. And she had paid for that wanting in the currency women always pay, quietly, privately, with no witness and no confessor. She pressed her brow against the cold glass and reminded herself this was different. This was practical, survival, not hope. She guarded that distinction carefully. The manor dwarfed anything Eliza had ever entered through the front door, which she did not. She came through the servants' entrance naturally and was led to a small but spotless room by the housekeeper, Mrs. Garrett, whose face carried the settled patience of a woman who had endured a great deal and fully expected to endure more. Mrs. Garrett said, already retreating down the corridor. Eliza asked no questions. She followed the sound. A single lamp lit the nursery. In the far corner, wedged into a chair far too stiff for its purpose, sat a man clutching a wailing infant with the focused desperation of someone diffusing an explosive. She assessed him quickly, the way she'd trained herself to read rooms, what mattered, what was wrong, what needed attending to first. He was younger than she'd anticipated, dark hair, broad shoulders, dressed as though the day had begun with purpose and lost it somewhere around midday. His cravat hung loose. His jaw was clenched in the unmistakable manner of a man refusing to let a bad situation worsen, an expression she recognized at once. The look of someone who has been holding themselves intact through sheer force of will for far too long and is beginning to run out. His eyes, when he lifted them to her, held that precise shade of grey found only in English skies moments before the weather breaks, and they were unmistakably spent, not merely tired, but hollowed out at the bone, in the way no amount of rest repairs. This was the Duke of Windermere. He looked like a man who had been holding everything together with bare hands for 3 weeks, and was beginning to understand it wasn't enough. "You are Mrs. Holt's person," he said. His voice ran low, measured, the voice of a man who had discovered that if he kept his tone even, the rest of him might hold. "Eliza Fernsby." "Yes, he won't eat." "I can see that," she said, and extended her arms. He hesitated. She watched the hesitation travel across his features, the quiet arithmetic of what was proper, what was safe, what protocol existed for surrendering your infant son to a woman you had known for roughly 45 seconds. She understood the pause. She did not have patience for it. "Your Grace," she said softly, "he is hungry. Everything else can wait." Something in him settled. He crossed the room and placed his son into her arms with a tenderness that was nearly difficult to witness, the exacting gentleness of a man terrified of doing it wrong. Henry Ashford, heir to the Windermere dukedom, was small and red and furious. He weighed almost nothing. He smelled of milk that wasn't quite right, and clean linen, and the particular desperation of a small body that had been demanding something and receiving nothing for too long. Eliza pressed him against her chest, and for one awful moment she felt it. The specific weight of holding an infant, the way her body remembered and answered before thought could intervene. The treacherous warmth. She did not think about her own son. She bolted that door and left it shut. She thought only of this child, this particular child who was hungry and afraid and had earned neither. The crying did not stop at once. It faded the way a storm passes, from full fury to hiccups to the small, tentative sounds of a body beginning cautiously to trust. His whole frame softened against her, degree by degree, the way a clenched fist slowly opens. Eliza breathed out. She did not look at the Duke. The Duke did not look away from her. Quote, _9__, he said. Not quite a question. It carried the quality of a man observing something he lacked the framework to explain. Quote, _10__. She said it plainly, the way she said most things. She was not by nature a woman who blunted her words to make them easier to swallow. Life had never rewarded her for softness. But she watched something shift in his face, small, involuntary, there and gone, and she stored it without examining it. She sat in the chair by the window. Henry fed. The Duke remained standing in the far corner, and Eliza carefully, deliberately, did not look at him. But she was aware of him. in the way one is aware of a candle flame in a dark room, not watching it directly, yet knowing always precisely where it burns. She was aware of the quality of his stillness, not relaxed, but arrested, as though something had caught him mid-step, and he had not yet decided how to proceed. She was aware he stayed far longer than propriety required. She was aware, when she finally heard him go, the soft, deliberate closing of the door, footsteps retreating down the corridor, that the room felt altered without him in it. She told herself it was simply the absence of another adult, the sudden quiet. She was not entirely persuaded. A routine assembled itself, as routines do, not by intention, but by the simple tyranny of a child who demanded feeding at the same hours each day and cared nothing for social convention. Eliza rose before dawn. Henry woke at 5, dependable as a church bell and twice as loud. She would hear him from her room down the hall. The first sounds, not quite crying, more like declarations, as if he were notifying the household of his requirements in advance of escalating measures. She would be halfway to the nursery before she was fully conscious. Moving on instinct, her body already knowing what was needed before her mind arrived. She did not expect to encounter the Duke in the corridor at 5 o'clock in the morning. She met the Duke in the corridor at 5 in the morning. Every day that week, without exception, he was fully dressed. That was what struck her first, and it disturbed her in some quiet, unnamed way, because it could only mean one of two things, and both were difficult. Either he hadn't slept at all, or he had risen in the black hours before dawn and dressed himself with the same rigid formality he carried through every waking moment, as though grief did not permit him even an unfastened collar. Watching him in those pale corridor mornings, she suspected the answer was both. The first morning, they only looked at each other, no words. She entered the nursery. He followed, stood in the corner, watched. She offered no explanation. He asked for none. When Henry was settled, Dorian left without a sound. The way a man exits a room he isn't certain he belongs in. The second morning, he was already there when she arrived, standing over the crib, not touching, just looking at his son, with a face so carefully held together, it told her everything about what lay beneath. She had learned this over years of observing people perform courage for one another. The most composed faces always carried the heaviest weather behind them. She did not announce herself. She crossed to the chair and sat. After a moment, he stepped back. The room held them both, and asked nothing of either. The third morning, she found him holding Henry, not with the terrified grip of their first encounter, but cautiously, one hand beneath the head, one beneath the back. His tall frame curved over this impossibly small creature with the labored, deliberate tenderness of a man teaching himself something he had no idea how to request instruction in. Henry was awake. He regarded his father with the solemn, unfocused gravity of a newborn surveying the whole of existence. Eliza stood in the doorway. She watched the Duke's face as his son made a small noise. Not a cry, something else entirely, something searching. And she saw the thing that moved through Dorian's expression in that unguarded instant, private and raw and without a name. She stepped back into the corridor. She waited a full minute before entering again, deliberately loud so he would hear her approach. It seemed the right thing to do. Neither of them mentioned it. But somewhere in the architecture of those early mornings, a door had opened, and neither of them shut it. It was the library that undid her first. In her second week, she had asked Mrs. Garrett whether there was anywhere in the house she might find something to read. Her days stretched long. Henry slept through the afternoons, and she had not thought to bring books. She had left Ashwick in something near a fugue state, packed only what was practical, left behind the small shelf of volumes she had gathered over years, with the careful, purposeful joy of someone who cannot afford many things but has decided books are not optional. Mrs. Garrett had looked at her with quiet surprise, the particular surprise of a woman adjusting a category in her mind. She told Eliza the library was on the second floor, east wing. The Duke would not mind. The library was the most beautiful room Eliza had ever entered. Floor to ceiling, 4 walls, every surface lined with books. A ladder on a brass rail, its grip worn smooth by decades of hands. Light fell through tall windows facing the garden, laying long gold bars across the spines. The smell of paper and age and something faintly like cedar, like a room that had been cherished for a very long time by people who understood how to love things without noise. She stood in the doorway a full minute before she trusted herself to step inside. She felt obscurely that she might not deserve it, that rooms like this were built for people with lineages she did not possess, that entering without some permission she hadn't received would expose her as a fraud. Then she thought, Mrs. Garrett said, and she went in. She was standing on the ladder, her finger tracing the spines of a row of natural philosophy. Buffon, Linnaeus, a worn copy of Gilbert White's Natural History she had wanted to read for 3 years and never managed to afford. The door opened behind her. "Eliza Fernsby," said the Duke. She nearly fell off the ladder. She did not fall. She possessed too much self-respect for anything less. But her hands tightened on the rail, both of them, and she turned to discover him filling the doorway. Shirt sleeves rolled, an expression on his face that carried, she was almost certain, the thinnest trace of amusement. So thin it could have been invention. She decided it was not. "Your Grace, I was told," Mrs. Garrett said. She was right, he answered plainly, already crossing toward the desk at the room's center. ___quote, _14, _____. He sat, opened a ledger, took up a pen, as if she were not present, as if the Duke of Windermere, sharing his library with the woman who nursed his son, required no explanation, as if the whole notion of what was proper had been quietly pensioned off and replaced by something more useful. Eliza retrieved the Gilbert White, descended, settled into the chair beside the window. Neither of them spoke for an hour. It was the deepest comfort she had known since her arrival. More than that, the deepest comfort she could recall in a span she could not quite measure. Something lived in the texture of that shared stillness, the particular ease of 2 people who owed each other no performance settled into her chest like a draught of warm air. She had not understood until that afternoon how much of her strength over the past 2 years had been consumed by performing. Performing fine, performing capable, performing undisturbed, performing the precise degree of composure a woman in her position was required to maintain simply to be regarded as human. None of that was needed here, in this library, in this chair, beside this man bent over his ledger, demanding nothing. She could simply be a woman reading a book about birds. The pleasure of it was almost too much to bear. He spoke at last without raising his eyes. "Quote 15, he said. A statement, not a question. He must have noticed when she climbed down. "Quote 16, she replied. "Quote 17, a pause. His pen scratched against the page. "Quote 18, he said. Quote 19. She looked at the shelves and considered what acceptance would mean. The slow gathering of afternoons in this room, in this chair, reading this man's books. She weighed how much she desired it, and how dangerous that desire was. "Thank you," she said. He nodded, gaze still lowered. And that was all. But when she left that evening, she noticed he had placed a bookmark on the desk's corner. A strip of burgundy ribbon set precisely where her eye would find it. Without remark, without ceremony, she took it. She used it. She said nothing about it the following morning in the corridor at 5. Neither did he. But she felt its presence, that small, quiet offering, the way one feels a hand reaching through darkness. Later, much later, when she tried to locate the moment everything shifted, she would return to those early library afternoons. Not because anything happened, because nothing did. Because for an hour at a stretch, in a room lined with books, two people carrying grief sat near each other and performed nothing at all. She would come to understand that this was the thing she had been starving for without a name. Not touch, not words. Only the permission to occupy a room without apology. That, she would realize, was rarer than she had ever known. It was Lord Perkle Ashford who said it aloud first. He arrived in the 4th week, 6 years younger than his brother, lighter in every conceivable way, carrying the easy assurance of a man who has never been asked to be the serious one. He swept through the front door as though he owned it, which technically he did not, and immediately began reshaping the house's atmosphere with the cheerful, heedless energy of someone who has never paused to consider that an atmosphere might wish to remain undisturbed. Eliza watched him at dinner. She took her meals with the upper staff. But Pearl had uncovered this arrangement within roughly 40 minutes of his arrival and pronounced it an abomination. And so she found herself at the family table, while Dorian regarded his brother with the resignation of a man long accustomed to losing particular battles. "Eliza Fernsby," said Pearl, dropping into his chair with enormous satisfaction. "My brother tells me Henry has taken to you entirely." "Henry has taken to being fed, my lord. I happen to be the one providing it." Pearl pointed at her. "Modest, Dorian. She's modest. I like her enormously." "Percy," said Dorian, in the tone of a man who had wielded that single word as a full sentence since boyhood. "I'm merely stating what I observe," Pearl went on, pouring wine for everyone, Eliza included, without so much as a glance of inquiry. "The last 4 women fled. This one sits at dinner, holding opinions. Something here is different." The Duke studied his wineglass. Eliza studied her plate. Lord Pearl glanced between them with the serene expression of a man watching something unfold in slow motion and possessing the good sense not to disturb it. She was turning Pearl's words over later that night. What it meant to be different, the specific peril of being noticed, when she heard it. She was coming back from a late feeding, drifting through the darkened corridor, and a sound arrested her. It issued from behind the shut door of Dorian's study. Not weeping, nothing so readable as that. A sound like something tightly governed, pressing against its own seams. The sound of a person who has held something for a very long time and has finally, in those small hours when no one watches, begun to lose his hold. She stood in the hallway. She told herself every reasonable thing. She was the wet nurse. She had no standing here. His grief belonged to him, and her compassion was nothing he had requested. The world she inhabited held firm ideas about what women in her position were owed and what they were allowed. None of those ideas included knocking on a duke's door at midnight because of a sound in the corridor. She stood in the hallway a long time. Then she knocked. His voice, level, perfectly constructed to close the exchange without admitting one had opened. Quote 30, quote, she said through the wood. Quote 31, quote, a longer silence, not empty, occupied. A person on the far side of a door arriving at a decision. The door opened. He had been sitting at the window. She could tell by the chair, angled wrong, pulled too near the glass. Outside, the grounds lay dark. The garden she had come to love by daylight was invisible now. Just blackness and the occasional shape of a tree against a marginally lighter sky. On the far wall hung a portrait. A woman, fair-haired, rendered with the stiff formality of an official likeness. Not cold precisely, but ceremonial in the way such portraits always were. As though the painter had been instructed to capture the title, not the person. Dorian stood in the doorway. He had shed his coat. His sleeves were pushed to the elbow, his hair slightly disordered in a way she had never witnessed. The evidence of hands dragged through it in frustration or anguish. The private proof of feelings he refused to make public. He looked, she thought, like a structure that had borne weight for a very long time, and was slowly becoming conscious of where the fractures ran. Eliza said. Something crossed his face, a swift succession of things, there and gone, like light shifting on water. Quote 34. Quote 35, she said. She was not being cruel. She was simply naming what was true, because she had learned that true things often went unspoken too long, and the silence around them grew teeth. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 36, underscore, underscore. He stared at her. She was aware distantly that this was possibly the most inappropriate thing she had ever uttered to anyone, let alone a duke, let alone her employer. She did not retract it. He was quiet a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice had shifted. Still careful, but a different species of careful. The carefulness of a man choosing precision over protection. Eliza said. Her voice barely carried. He held her gaze for a long moment. Something in his face had opened in a way she hadn't witnessed before. Not vulnerability precisely, something more specific. The look of a man who has stumbled through a language for years and only now heard it pronounced with perfect clarity. And yours? He asked. She did not pretend to misunderstand. Mine has a name. It simply has no remedy. I'm sorry, he said, plain, without theatre. I know, she said. So am I. She left him there in the study with the dark glass and the stiff portrait on the wall. But something had turned quietly between them, without declaration, the way a tide shifts, and no one can mark the precise second it chose to change. Neither of them walked away from that conversation as the person who had walked into it. She lay thinking about this in her narrow bed at the far end of the east corridor, listening to the house creak and settle around her. She thought about how strange it was that grief could serve as a bridge, if you allowed it. That two people bearing different weights might recognize the shape of each other's load across every barrier the world had stacked between them, and feel, for a moment, dangerously, less alone. She told herself to be careful. She fell asleep already failing at it. Lady Constance arrived on a Tuesday, 2 trunks of luggage, the particular energy of a woman who has concluded she is the answer to a problem and is simply waiting for the rest of the room to realize it. She was beautiful, Lady Constance, Eliza could admit this with the steady honesty of years spent being the other woman in the room. Fair-skinned, composed, dressed with the quiet restraint of someone who has never needed to try. She carried the effortless authority of a woman who had never once entered a room and questioned whether it belonged to her. She had loved the late Duchess like a sister. She wore her mourning with style and what appeared to be genuine feeling, a combination Eliza found herself respecting even as she registered the danger in it. Lady Constance was not performing sorrow. She was truly grieving. She simply held the conviction that grief and pragmatism could coexist, and that the pragmatic answer to the Duke's circumstances had always been plain. She noticed Eliza on the third day. "The wet nurse," she said, materializing in the corridor with the ease of someone who treats every hallway as an extension of her own drawing room. "Yes," Mrs. Garrett mentioned. "How long do you intend to stay, Eliza Fernsby?" "As long as Henry needs me, my lady. Children outgrow wet nurses rather quickly, you know." Lady Constance's smile was kind, the way a closed door is kind. No cruelty in it, simply shut. __quote _48__. Eliza smiled back. The smile women learn when someone has said something that deserves an altogether different reply. __quote _49__. Lady Constance regarded her a moment longer, the appraising look of a woman accomplished at reading situations. Then a single nod, and she continued down the corridor. Eliza stood motionless for a breath afterward. She was not precisely afraid of Lady Constance, but she recognized what the woman represented. A reminder of everything that stood between Eliza Fernsby and the life she had begun, foolishly, without anyone's permission, to imagine. She found Dorian in the library that evening, not by design. She went because it was the one room in the house that felt like breathing, and he was already there, standing at the window with a glass of brandy and the slightly flattened expression of a man who had been gracious for 7 consecutive hours and was nearing the edge of it. He turned when she entered. She faltered, suddenly conscious of Lady Constance, of everything that name carried, of the shape this moment had taken around her before she'd quite chosen to enter it. "Quote 50, quote," she said. "Quote 51, quote." A beat, softer. "Quote 52, quote." She lowered herself into the chair. He remained at the window. Rain had started outside, that soft, relentless English kind. Rain with no intention of stopping, no drama to it, just quiet persistence. "Quote 53, he said at last. "Quote 54. He turned the glass slowly between his fingers. A pause. He said quietly. Eliza studied her own hands. She was acutely aware of the space between them. 12 feet, perhaps 15, and equally aware it was not sufficient. Not because she wished it smaller, because she was becoming, despite every private effort against it, attuned to him in ways that had nothing to do with wages. She noticed when exhaustion settled over him. She noticed when he was making an effort that extracted a cost. She noticed the particular texture of his attention when he entered a room. Steady, unhurried. The attention of a man who had learned to look closely at things because he'd spent too many years looking at the wrong ones. She was aware of noticing. She was aware the noticing had become a problem. She was choosing, with great precision, to do nothing about it. "Your Grace," she began carefully. "Dorian," she looked up. "When we are alone," he said, "please." Something lived in his voice. Not command, nothing near command. A request. the kind that understands it is reaching for more than it pretends. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds, 2 seconds longer than wisdom allowed. "That would be unwise," she said. "Yes," he agreed. He did not withdraw it. "I am employed in your household. I'm aware, and my situation is not—" She stopped, started again. "I am not someone you should be asking things of, even small things." He set down the brandy glass. When he spoke again, his voice carried a different kind of care. Not shielding himself, trying not to startle her. "I know what your situation is, Eliza Fernsby. I know what was done to you. I know you arrived here with nothing and have given my son everything, your time, your attention, your body's own sustenance, and that you sit in my library reading natural philosophy and argue with my brother over crop rotation, and make me feel for the first time in months that this house holds something beyond the echo of what went wrong." Rain struck the glass. "I am asking," he said, "for nothing more than your name. When we are alone, that is all." A long silence. The rain, the lamp, the 12 feet between them that felt like nothing and everything at once. "Dorian," she said. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, the way a person closes their eyes around something they want to keep. "Thank you," he said. She did not say "you're welcome." She picked up her book. She read 3 pages without absorbing a single word. Henry Ashford learned to smile in his 7th week. Not a reflex. Those had come earlier. The random muscular twitches that parents hopefully read as smiles, but which are merely a face discovering its own range. This was different. This was genuine, full and sudden and directed, aimed at a face he knew. It arrived like weather, unexpected, transformative, reshaping everything it touched. He smiled first at Eliza, and she received it with the particular tenderness of a woman who has learned to accept love cautiously in case it is reclaimed. She held perfectly still when it happened, as if any sudden movement might undo it, and she looked at him. This small, solemn face suddenly illuminated from within. Something shifted in her chest, something she had believed was finished shifting. She was not his mother. She knew this. She reminded herself with the disciplined regularity of someone managing a chronic condition. She was his wet nurse. She was temporary. She was here because of biology and necessity and the pragmatism of grief, not because she belonged to him or he to her. She repeated this to herself, and then he smiled at her once more, and the repetition grew slightly harder to believe. He smiled at Mrs. Garrett, who appeared briefly and deeply undone before reassembling her expression into its usual efficiency. He smiled at Lord Pearl, who pronounced it the finest accomplishment in 3 generations of Ashfords, and spent 20 minutes attempting to coax a second one. He smiled at the curtains, less significant, but equally fervent. He smiled at his father on a Wednesday morning. Eliza was there. She was always there in the mornings now, not summoned, simply present, the way a person becomes present in a place that has begun to matter. She sat in the chair beside the window. Henry was awake, kicking his feet with the private delight of someone discovering their limbs' answer to will. Then Dorian entered. Henry heard the footsteps. He turned his head toward the sound, that new, purposeful turning that had replaced the earlier aimless drifting, and found his father's face, and smiled. The Duke of Windermere stopped walking. He stopped as though the ground ahead had simply ceased to exist. He stood perfectly still, looking at his son. Eliza watched something cross his face she had never witnessed there before, something she would never afterward find adequate language for. It was not grief. It was not happiness precisely. It held both and exceeded either. It was the face of a man who had spent weeks braced for the worst of everything, and had just been told by the least prepared of messengers that he was wrong. He crossed the room slowly, bent over the crib. Henry seized his finger with both hands, with the total conviction of someone who has decided this particular object is theirs and will not be surrendering it. Dorian laughed, quiet, under his breath, startled entirely past himself, but a laugh. A true one, unguarded, uncontrolled, the sort that is never performed, but simply escapes. Eliza pressed her hand against her mouth. She turned toward the window. Outside, the garden was beginning, cautiously, to lean towards spring. She did not cry. She had established a rule about crying in the nursery. She honored it. It cost her dearly. The word arrived at 4 months. Henry had been producing sounds for weeks. Experimental syllables of a child testing the machinery of speech, discovering that his mouth could create effects in the world. Ba and da and long vowel sounds launched at the ceiling with profound seriousness, as though delivering formal remarks to the plasterwork. Eliza spoke to him constantly, partly because she had read that language grew from hearing it, partly because talking to Henry was the only conversation she had each day that demanded nothing from her in return. She described the plants in the garden, which she had been studying with the head gardener on her afternoon walks. She told him about the books she was reading. She told him, carefully, in a voice that would not travel past the two of them, about the village where she had grown up, the smell of the bakery on the high street in winter, the particular way her father's hands had rested when he read, large and quiet, in his lap. She told him about a man she had loved, the specific way he had spoken her name the first time, which had made her believe, foolishly, that something in the saying meant something. She told Henry things she had never spoken aloud to anyone, because he could not repeat them, and because the telling felt necessary in ways she chose not to examine too closely. She was describing sparrows, the way they gathered in the hedge outside her window and moved as one being, a single, rippling shape composed of hundreds of smaller ones, when it happened. She stopped talking. The room went very still. Henry looked at her. His face, for a 4-month-old, had grown remarkably readable. She had learned to interpret its moods the way one learns to interpret weather. This expression was concentrated, effortful, the look of a person attempting something with great precision. He said it again. Not Mama, not Dada. Liza. Imperfect, approximate. 4 months old, the consonants still finding their footing, but unmistakable and aimed directly at her. Spoken with the triumphant certainty of someone who has been laboring toward this moment for a long while and is deeply satisfied to have arrived. She did not cry. She held Henry to her chest, chin resting on the crown of his head, and she breathed with the slow deliberation of someone keeping themselves from falling apart. The rule she had made, she held it, and it had never cost her more, because now she understood what this was, what she had become to this child, what that would mean when the day came to walk away. She had known it in theory from the start. Now she knew it in the marrow of her bones. Now it had a name. And the name was the shape of her own name in a 4-month-old's mouth. The most beautiful sound she had ever heard, and the most devastating. Dorian had been standing in the doorway. She had no idea for how long. She hadn't heard him enter, and later she would turn that question over. How many seconds, how many breaths he had watched before she noticed. When she finally raised her eyes, he wore an expression she could not classify, something that lived in the narrow space between reverence and grief and the specific fear of a man who has just grasped a truth that will make every choice after it harder. Dorian said, barely above a whisper. Her voice wavered. Dorian's gaze shifted to his son, then back to her.
So do I.
The silence after those words had weight and texture. Eliza rose. She needed suddenly to be anywhere but this room. I'll bring him to you after his next feeding, she said, in the tone she used when the world had to be practical or it would be unbearable. He's been sleeping well in the afternoons. You might try reading to him. A low voice. I found he responds to it. She walked out of the nursery. She went to her room. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed and allowed herself briefly, behind a closed door, in the privacy of that small space, to feel the full measure of what was happening to her. The thing she had refused to name. The thing that had been building quietly in the spaces between library afternoons and corridor mornings and one conversation through a door at midnight. She let it in. All of it. For exactly 3 minutes. Then she stood, splashed water on her face, and returned to work. Lady Constance found her in the garden the next afternoon. Eliza had gone outside because the house had become too dense with things she couldn't face directly. The nursery held Henry and the echo of that word. The library held a chair by the window and a bookmark given without ceremony. The corridor held the mornings. Every room in Windermere Manor had become, without her permission, loaded with something she could neither carry nor set down. She had walked to the far boundary of the garden, past the formal hedges, into a wilder stretch the head gardener referred to, with quiet disapproval, as the old part. The planting there predated the current house and had long since decided for itself what it wished to become. She liked it there. It felt honest. Lady Constance materialized at the edge of the trimmed hedges as if she had been waiting for the precise moment. Eliza suspected she had. Quote, 75. Quote, she said, stepping into place beside her. Quote, 76. Quote, 77. Quote, 78. Quote. Eliza said nothing. She kept her gaze on the old garden, on a climbing rose that had wound its way up an ancient stone wall and was beginning, tentatively, to bud. Lady Constance said. Her voice was measured and not cruel. A pause. Eliza said. Lady Constance replied softly. A long silence stretched between them, the honest silence of two women who both comprehend with perfect, unflinching clarity the architecture of the world they inhabit. How indifferent its machinery is to what is real, what is true, what is deserved. Eliza thought of the 3 minutes in her room, how precisely she had measured them, how completely she had failed to feel nothing. Quote 84, quote, she said. Quote 85. Quote. Lady Constance gave a single nod, and did, Eliza noticed, possess the grace to wear it like a cost. No triumph lived in that face, only the look of a woman who has done what conviction demanded, and takes no pleasure in the demand. Lady Constance said. Eliza replied, and meant it. She had not intended to say goodbye. A letter had seemed cleaner for him, cleaner for her, because she knew herself well enough to understand that if she spoke it to his face, she would speak it badly, and badly would be worse than silence. But she went to the library. She told herself it was for the Gilbert White left on the table. She told herself 3 minutes. She told herself a great many things standing in that corridor, and not one of them was entirely honest. She had been in the library 20 minutes, holding the book, a sheet of paper, a pen, writing nothing at all, when she heard him. Dorian sent from the doorway. She set the pen down. Quote, 90, quote, 91. He stepped into the room. Quote, 92. She made herself stay precisely where she was, made herself not step back, which was what her body demanded, and also not step forward, which was what some other, less sensible part of her wanted. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 93, underscore, underscore. Not a question, a thing already known. Quote, 94, she said, and her voice held steadier than she deserved. Quote, 95. She stopped, started again quieter. Quote, 96. Her gaze moved to the window. The lamp, anywhere but his face. A breath. She forced herself to look at him, forced herself to hold. He was silent a long time, long enough that the quality of that silence shifted, became not hesitation, but the particular sound of a man facing an honest question with an honest answer, and finding his answer insufficient. She watched him reach for something true and good and enough, and watched him fail. And she loved him for the reaching, and it made nothing easier. She said softly. She picked up the pen, wrote the letter, brief, professional, the letter of a woman certain of her course. She placed it on his desk. She took the Gilbert White. She walked from the library. She did not look back. Had she turned, she would have seen him standing perfectly still at the room's center, holding her letter, wearing the expression of a man who has just been shown, with devastating precision, what his silence cost. She did not turn. Some mercies you must grant yourself. She was gone 11 days. He counted every one. The house remained the same. That was the maddening thing. The house stayed entirely, stubbornly, insultingly unchanged. The same corridors, the same rooms, the same library with the same chair beside the window, which he could not glance at without feeling something he had no name for. The same east corridor at 5 in the morning, which was merely a corridor now. Empty in a way corridors are not meant to be empty, because corridors do not ordinarily hold presences. Not ones you notice, not ones you miss. He noticed. He missed. He said none of it aloud. He was the Duke of Windermere, and there existed no protocol for what moved through him. He had spent his entire adult life reshaping his inner terrain to match the demands of the outer one. It was failing him now. Henry did not understand where she had gone, too young to grasp it. Old enough to feel the wrongness, a missing note in the only music he had ever known. He grew fretful, then quiet, then fretful again, in the way of someone who senses a fracture but cannot find its source. On the 3rd day, he said her name. Just once. Into the still nursery at the 5 o'clock hour, the dark corridor hour, the hour when she had always come, as though announcing himself to someone who should have been waiting. No one answered. Dorian stood in the doorway and listened to his son call for a woman who was not there. Something passed through him that had no English word, only the flat, surgical knowledge that he was the reason for her absence, that his silence, when she had asked the only question that mattered, had been its own reply. On the fifth day, Lord Pearl looked at him across the breakfast table and said without preamble, quote, 101, quote, 102, quote, 103, quote, 104, quote. Pearl set down his fork. Quote, 105, quote, 106, quote. Dorian said. His voice was level. He was profoundly tired of it being level. Quote, 107, quote. Pearl went quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the lightness had drained from his voice. Quote, 108, quote, he said. Quote, 109, quote. Dorian looked at his brother. Quote, 110, quote, he said. Quote, 111, quote. Pearl leaned closer. Quote, 112, quote. A long silence. Quote, 113, Dorian said quietly. Quote, 114, quote. 115, Pearl said simply. Quote, 116. Dorian held his brother's gaze for a long time. He thought of the letter she had left on his desk. Brief, professional, the handwriting of a woman who had decided. He had read it 6 times. Each reading sharpened the outline of what he had failed to say, and what that failure had cost her. A woman already failed once by someone's silence, someone's absence, someone's careful non-commitment. Failed again by his. He thought of Henry speaking her name into the empty nursery. He thought of the bookmark, the ribbon on the desk, the quiet and total way she had sat in a chair and read for an hour and asked nothing of him. The way she had said his name, Dorian. For the first time in the lamplight, rain pressing against the windows. He stood up. He called for his horse. She was in her father's garden when he came. It was a small garden, nothing remotely like Windmere, nothing like that older section with its climbing roses and the wall that seemed to possess its own temperament. But it belonged to her father, and it was known to her, and it carried that particular green scent of Somerset when spring first arrives. She had been standing in it for 20 minutes, achieving nothing beyond the deliberate labor of keeping her mind empty. 11 days in her father's house, helping where she could, sleeping long, heavy hours. She had been slowly, painstakingly performing the work of persuading herself that she had chosen correctly, the sensible path. The path that shielded Henry and Dorian and whatever small, fragile existence she might eventually construct from the wreckage left behind. She had not finished persuading herself. The task continued. She suspected, given enough time, it might eventually hold. She was in the garden when the sound of hooves reached her. He looked worse than she had ever seen him. That registered before she had fully absorbed that it was him at all. Road dust, hair in disarray, the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 11 days at war with himself and has finally, at great cost, surrendered. He swung down before his horse had come to a full stop. He crossed the grass with the stride of someone who has reached a decision and refuses to give himself room to retreat from it. Quote, 117, she started. Quote, 118, he said. He stopped before her, close enough that she had to tilt her chin upward. A brief, absurd thought passed through her. How tall he was. How she had never quite adjusted to it. The way his scale rearranged every space he occupied. Quote, 119, Underscore, he said. His voice was level. It had cost him dearly to make it level. She could hear the price. Quote, 120. He paused, not losing his nerve, gathering it. Quote, 121. His jaw tightened. Briefly. Quote, 122. Something deep in her chest had gone very still, very warm. Quote, 123, he went on. Quote, 124. Quote, 125, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. She had stopped trying to make it so. He said quietly. He reached out and took her hands, both of them, with the same careful, deliberate grip she had watched him use the first time he held his son, as though he understood precisely what he was holding. Quote, 130, quote, he said. Quote, 131. Quote, he paused. Quote, 132. Quote, she looked at him for a long time. She had sworn to herself after the last time she would not be moved by words. She would demand evidence. She would not allow the shape of a sentence, however finely built, to convince her of something only time and action could prove. She had made that vow. She had meant to honor it. She still meant to honor it. But he had ridden through the night. That was not a sentence. That was not a promise. That was a man who had measured the distance against the alternative and chosen the distance. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 133, underscore, underscore, she said. Her tone was measured, deliberate, the voice of a woman who loves someone and is still attempting to shield herself from the weight of it. Quote, 134, quote, 135, he said. Quote, 136, quote, 137, she said at last. Quote, 138, quote. Dorian's mouth lifted. I suspect he will find it enormously amusing. He has your sense of humor, meaning none. He laughed. That open, ungoverned laugh she had carried in her chest like a smooth, warm stone for 11 days. She had taken it out each evening, examined it, and placed it carefully back. She stepped forward. He closed the distance. She would say afterward that the kiss was nothing like what she had imagined, not the dramatic, consuming thing she had encountered in novels and never quite trusted. Not a declaration, simply honest. Two people who had weathered the worst of each other, the grief, the silence, the carefully maintained adequacy. Choosing yes, choosing it plainly, without theater, without terms. Her hands found the front of his coat. His arms came around her, cautious first, then certain, the way he approached most things. Slowly, deliberately, and then completely. Simple and absolute and entirely, wholly hers. Henry Ashford took his first steps on a Tuesday morning in the nursery at Windmere Manor, between his father's outstretched hands and his mother's voice. He had been threatening to walk for a fortnight, putting himself upright against every available surface, standing with the intense, furrowed focus of someone solving a deeply complicated problem, then lowering himself back down, with an expression suggesting the problem needed further consideration. The household had existed in suspended anticipation. Even Mrs. Garrett had been observed hovering near the nursery door at intervals. It happened on an ordinary Tuesday with no ceremony at all. Dorian was on his knees at one end of the nursery, hands extended. Eliza was at the other, Henry braced against her leg. She said his name the way she always said it. warm and certain and without condition. Henry looked at her, looked at his father, made the calculation. 4 steps, unsteady, gloriously effortful, each one an act of faith. Then he sat down with great purpose, regarded them both, and said what sounded unmistakably like, "Well." Dorian laughed until his eyes were bright. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth, shoulders shaking, and his son observed him with profound satisfaction. The satisfaction of someone who has produced precisely the intended effect. Eliza, the Duchess of Windermere, in a marriage that had scandalized exactly the number of people her husband predicted and delighted exactly the number Lord Pearl had predicted, which was most of them, sat on the nursery floor in a morning gown that cost more than she once earned in a year. She held out her arms. Henry crawled back to her, used her sleeve to stand, regarded the distance to his father with the air of a person reassessing a challenge, and tried again. There is a kind of grief no one prepares you for, but there is also a kind of love like that, the kind that does not announce itself, that does not arrive in a grand gesture or a turning point you can circle on a calendar, that enters instead through small doors, a corridor at 5 in the morning, a bookmark placed without comment on a desk, a child who learns your name before any other, the kind built over weeks and months from shared silence and honest conversation, and the radical, quietly revolutionary act of being known, the kind that chooses you before you have chosen it, before you are ready, before you have argued yourself back into believing you deserve it. And when it finds you, even in the ruins, even in the grief, even in the body that has been broken, and the heart that has been abandoned, and the life that was taken before it could begin, you will recognize it by this. It will not ask you to be all right. It will not require you to perform or explain or diminish yourself so that it may be more comfortable. It will simply stay. And that, in the end, is everything. If this story lingered, if Eliza's grief settled heavy behind your ribs, if the moment Henry spoke her name stopped your breathing, if Dorian's midnight ride finally let something in your chest unlock, tell me. Drop it in the comments. Which moment held you? I read every single one. I mean that. And if you arrived here for the first time and stayed until this final breath, welcome. This is what lives here. Stories of people broken in ways no one mourns aloud, finding their way to each other. Subscribe so the next one finds you. And if someone in your life needs a love story right now, send this their way. Sometimes that's enough. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves and each other. I'll see you in the next one.